Hello, everybody, and welcome to Grey History. In this special collaboration episode with the Art of Crime podcast, I team up with Gavin Whitehead to explore some of the most amazing pieces of revolutionary art. Gavin's show, The Art of Crime, is currently exploring the work of Madame Tussaud, founder of the famous wax museums and someone who actually got her start during the French Revolution. So, what we've done is create our own little exhibition, where each of us has selected 3 amazing artworks from the Revolutionary era. We'll take turns unpacking each other's selections, and I am willing to wager that it's more than possible that you have only heard of perhaps 1 or 2 of the artworks. The first is fairly recognizable, but after that, they become more obscure and more fascinating. So, you're going to have an absolute blast, and once you're done, you can find The Art of Crime and Gavin's 3rd season on Madame Tussaud wherever you get your podcasts. But before we get into it, a humongous thank you to the Grey History community for keeping Grey History on the air. Members of the community make a small donation when main narrative episodes are first released, and that contribution not only helps me produce the main narrative episodes, but it also lets me bring you fun collaboration episodes like this one. So please, to enjoy ad-free listening, to indulge in hours of bonus content, and most importantly, to help ensure that there's more Grey History waiting for you tomorrow, support the show today. A small donation, like a cup of coffee, goes a lot further than you might think. Finally, a quick reminder that members with early access can already enjoy episode 73, Napoleon's Triumph, and the 3 episode extras that go alongside it. Members have loved the last episode on Toulon's Revolt, and many are drawing comparisons to more recent events. Also, I have uploaded a video update on Patreon, which everyone can watch. So if you're interested in all things Grey History for the rest of 2024, from collaborations to live streams to bonus content and the trial of the Queen, please check it out. I'll place links in the show notes and in the newsletter, as well as on the website and social media. Anyway, that's enough from me, so let's get into it. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this special collaboration episode between Grey History, the French Revolution, and the Art of Crime. Joining me today is Gavin Whitehead. Gavin, how are you going?
I'm doing well. Glad to be here.
Perfect. For those people that aren't familiar with, I suppose, our other shows, my name is Will Clark, and I'm the host of Grey History, the French Revolution, which is a long-form series on the ambiguities and nuances of one of the most important events in our history. And so we're slowly but surely working our way roughly chronologically through the French Revolution. We're about 60 or so episodes in, and we're just hitting really the start of the Reign of Terror. And Gavin, for the benefit of my listeners, do you want to explain what you're doing not only in your previous seasons, but I think they'll be particularly interested in your current season of The Art of Crime?
I am the host and creator of The Art of Crime. It's a history podcast about the unlikely collisions between true crime and the arts. Each season is structured around a different theme, and season 3 is titled Queen of Crime, Madame Tussaud, and the Chamber of Horrors. So it tells 2 stories. First, it chronicles the long and distinguished career of Madame Tussaud, one of the most celebrated showwomen of her day, kicking off in pre-revolutionary Paris and wrapping up in Victorian London. Each episode covers a chapter in her biography. So the season tells 2 stories, right? Second, it charts the evolution of the Chamber of Horrors. a special showroom inside Tussauds Wax Museum that exhibited macabre curiosities, including effigies of notorious murderers. Just as each episode advances the narrative of Tussauds' life story, each episode is structured around a noteworthy crime or criminal or prisoner or prison. So how does this tie into the French Revolution, you might wonder? Tussaud bore witness to the French Revolution, and she made some really important art about it. It might come as a surprise to listeners, but she exhibited relics about the French Revolution in general and the Reign of Terror in particular inside the Chamber of Horrors. So, for example, there was a tableau of Jean-Paul Marat assassinated in his bath. There was a model of the guillotine and the Bastille. We'll talk a little bit more about it in a few minutes. This artwork played a really important role in shaping the way that Tussauds' contemporaries and then later future generations imagined the French Revolution. So that's sort of why I'm here to talk to Will about the French Revolution. We kicked around a few ideas and trying to decide what we wanted to talk about today. And we decided each to pick our 3 favorite artworks from or about the French Revolution. So, Will, maybe you want to start us off with your first pick?
Yeah, so my first pick is rather interesting. It's about one of the most foundational events of the French Revolution, but despite its importance, the artwork that I've selected is actually incomplete. So what I've nominated is the Tennis Court Oath, which is an incomplete painting by Jacques-Louis David. There is also a sketch of what this painting was going to look like, and that is more complete. And the sketch and the painting combined are probably, well, they've got to be the most recognizable or one of the most recognizable and studied artworks of the entire French Revolution. And that's because this piece of art is simultaneously uplifting, depressing, and all in all, fascinating. Now, I suppose just before we get into the piece of art, for those unfamiliar with the background or the historical events behind it, in June 1789, the Estates General was meeting in Versailles. Now, the Estates General was a traditional advisory body which consisted of delegates from France's 3 estates, so the clergy, the aristocracy, and the commoners. And the Estates General hadn't actually met in almost 200 years, but it was being summoned to help the French monarchy avoid bankruptcy. And the reason why the monarchy had really delayed this for quite some time, or, there had been almost 2 centuries between Estates General, is that we had been in the era of French absolutism, absolute monarchy and absolute power, theoretically resting with the person of the king. And they being the monarchs, were really reluctant to call Estates Generals, as particularly in the late 18th century, it was feared that this would be a nod towards permanent constitutional government. And, these worst nightmares did come to be. When the Estates General met in mid-1789, things went pear-shaped really quickly. The deputies of the Third Estate, so those representing the commons, they essentially refused to cooperate with the so-called privileged orders of the clergy and the aristocracy. And what we get is weeks and weeks of deadlock. And eventually they try to force the issue. And so just days before the so-called Tennis Court Oath, the deputies of the Third Estate, joined by a couple deputies representing the clergy, they unilaterally declare themselves the National Assembly on the 17th of June, 1789. Now, needless to say, the royal court doesn't like this particularly. They do want to reverse these actions, but unfortunately for them, the situation escalates again just days later. And so on the 20th of June, the new National Assembly, they find their meeting hall closed, and in quite an agitated way, they are worried about a military crackdown. And so they decide to gather in a nearby Tennis Court Oath and continue their deliberations there. To be clear, this is an indoor tennis court, so you can picture a rather sparse rectangular building rather than some beautiful grass court next to a palace. But it's in this iconic place that we get one of the key moments of the French Revolution. It's here that we get the so-called Tennis Court Oath. And the oath is pretty simple. All the deputies but one that are present, they swear not to separate until the constitution of the kingdom is established. And so in swearing this oath, what we essentially get is something equivalent to the Declaration of Independence. I mean, they're not like for like, but where they are similar is the fact that we get a point from which there is no going back. The deputies have now publicly resolved that France will become a constitutional monarchy, And, really the only pathway forward for the court is to try a military crackdown, which they will do. And I know that you're going to talk about that in a second. So I suppose what I would point out is the genie is now permanently out of the bottle, though. I mean, even after Napoleon's downfall and the monarchy is restored, there is some form of constitutional government going forth in France. But to turn our attention maybe now to the artwork itself, why have I chosen this piece of art? And why is there a piece of art that is simultaneously so famous about such an important event, and yet it's incomplete? The problem here is that, the French Revolution is a wild ride, and it's famous for being a revolution which devours its children. And in a few short years, this event becomes politically problematic, not because of what happened, but because of the leading figures in it. I mean, if you look at the leading figures in David's sketch, many of them are either dead or discredited within just 5 years. You've got Bailly, you've got Robespierre, Barnave, Mirabeau. I mean, the latter does die of natural causes, which is a pleasant change of pace, but depending on one's politics, all of these figures are discredited and they are all dead. Furthermore, in addition to these kind of more leading figures, you've got other smaller symbolic features that have also soured with time. So, for example, right in the foreground of this piece of art, you've got 3 clerics embracing. What you have there is a monk, a Protestant pastor, and a priest, all of whom are, theoretically uniting or representing unity and national regeneration. France had a terrible history in terms of its religious civil wars and conflicts. But in reality, this is, fake art. This is just all symbolism. I mean, the monk wasn't there, and he would later inspire, not deliberately, but he would later inspire pro-Catholic riots in the South. The Protestant pastor is beheaded in the Terror, and the priest in the center will later decry subsequent de-Christianization efforts in the Republican era, and also the destruction of art during the revolutionary Republican era as well. Essentially, what we have here is this beautiful piece of art, the sketch, and then the associated unfinished painting, and it recounts a fundamental turning point in the revolution. But the problem here is that you can't airbrush out several leading figures and prominent symbols, and so we end up with this unfinished masterpiece that not only represents a key event of the revolution, but in being unfinished, represents so much about the revolution itself. And I suppose just for everyone's benefit, Gavin and I will make sure that we put photos and depictions and the like of these various pieces of artwork on our social media channels and the like, so that you can follow along, and there'll be a link in the show notes.
Fascinating. Do we know anything about why David decided to leave the painting unfinished? Was there a clear moment where he decided, it's just too dangerous for me to move forward with this?
I'm not sure about when precisely he would have made that decision, but already by late 1793, there are leading figures in that painting that have been executed for crimes against the state. So leading members of the National Assembly. Mirabeau is not executed. He dies of natural causes, but he's discredited by this point in time. But people like Bailly, who's kind of standing up and is one of the most prominent features in this piece of art. He's the first mayor of Paris. He's implicated in a mass shooting, kind of clamping down on I suppose you would say, a petition around the dethronement of the king after the king tries and fails to escape the country. And so his connection with that results in his later execution. You've also got other figures in there that are again tied to, let's call it the era of constitutional monarchy. And by the time that you get to the Republic, even someone who was quite a radical constitutional monarchist, the key word there is monarchist, and that was enough to put a target on your back, particularly if you played leading roles in the first, what we call the National Constituent Assembly, that body that gave France its first constitution.
Well, thanks. That is fascinating. And as you said in your introduction to the artwork, there are certainly uplifting and depressing aspects to it. So my first pick is Madame Tussaud's effigy of the Comte de Lorge. So the Comte de Lorge is a figure associated with the Bastille. As listeners of both of our shows will know, by 1789, the Bastille has become the ultimate embodiment of old regime tyranny, right? Prisoners are sent there for mysterious reasons, often without a trial. At the Bastille, they suffer unspeakable cruelty. There are accounts of prisoners getting thrown into dungeons and waking up to find rats crawling all over them. Maybe the most famous prisoner is the man in the Iron Mask, legendary figure, supposedly the brother of Louis XIV and a rival to the throne. Anyway, it's essentially hell on earth. Not a great place. In 1789, on July 14th, the storming of the Bastille takes place. The invaders eventually overrun the governor, the Marquis de Launay, and his men, and they proceed to liberate the prisoners in the Bastille. So this unleashes a wave of propaganda that is really enthusiastic about this event. And it is as if tyranny itself has fallen with the Bastille because it had this reputation. As the invaders are exploring the Bastille, they descend into one of the deepest, darkest dungeons in the entire prison. And inside, they come upon a very old man who has a haunted look on his face, great white beard that reaches all the way down to his waist. He's extremely gaunt. He's chained up. He's clearly been here for a while. They come to discover that this man is named the Comte de Lorge, and he has been in the Bastille for no fewer than 32 years. So what has he done to deserve this wretched fate, you ask? Well, he committed the unpardonable offense of essentially accusing the French royal court of corruption. And that was it. That was enough to land him inside this dungeon. A journalist by the name of Jean-Paul Cara publishes a pamphlet about the Comte de Lorge in September 1789, so a few months after the storming of the Bastille, and helps to kind of disseminate the story of his experiences in the prison. And I'm just going to read a quote from that quickly. This is the Comte de Lorge about his confinement in the Bastille. The years flew by and brought no change at all in my fate. Sad and in low spirits, I let my days pass in bitterness and cursed despotism and its accomplices. The Comte de Lorge's story really strikes a chord with the public. I mean, he has really suffered the full force of old regime tyranny in the Bastille. Right, so someone decides that future generations need to know about him and his story. And they have the bright idea of taking the Comte de Lorge to Paris's most famous wax museum where Madame Tussaud works. And so she makes a life-size wax likeness of Comte de Lorge. It looks pretty much just as I've described him. There's a long white beard. He's extremely gaunt. He has kind of hollow cheeks. He's a very old man, probably in his 60s or 70s. And Tussaud actually publishes her memoirs in the late 1830s, and she describes this encounter in the process of kind of making this effigy. Shortly after this takes place, the Comte de Lorge's tale comes to a woeful end. He has re-entered a world that he no longer quite recognizes, and he's almost overwhelmed by this newfound sense of liberty. And he actually is said to have begged others to return him to his dungeon at the Bastille, which was not easy to accomplish because, the Bastille had been demolished and taken apart stone by stone. So this poor, miserable Comte de Lorge dies alone, and that's the end of his story. Well, the statue of the Comte de Lorge sticks around for many, many decades. In fact, it becomes one of the most popular displays at Madame Tussaud's Wax Museum, even after she leaves France to tour in the United Kingdom. Charles Dickens, a big fan of Madame Tussaud's, saw the Comte de Lorge and wrote about it in print, and the Comte de Lorge even inspired a character in his novel about the French Revolution, A Tale of Two Cities. So there's a character in there called Dr. Manette who emerges from confinement in the Bastille very much traumatized and unable to kind of carry on conversations with others. So he's sort of reminiscent of the Comte de Lorge. So that is the story of the Comte de Lorge. Will, can I gauge, what are your reactions?
I think it's a fascinating story. I wasn't aware of the connection with Dickens as well in A Tale of Two Cities, but it's hard to imagine. I think in contemporary times, I suppose it must be like going to maybe like an East German prison in the 70s and coming out to kind of unified Germany in the mid-90s. And your entire world would be different. So I can see why he would have struggled to find his place with it. I think it's an interesting story. You'd love to kind of grab him for a drink and just kind of pick his brain about how he felt about it all.
Yes. I mean, in many ways, it was believable to a lot of Tussaud's contemporaries, and a lot of observers were very much ready to sympathize with him. And actually, it came out that the entire story was made up. The Comte de Lorge never went to the Bastille. He never even existed. So we know for a fact that at the time of the storming of the Bastille, there were 7 prisoners inside. We know their names and we know why they were there. But none of these prisoners were named the Comte de Lorge. And in fact, as subsequent historians have shown, the Bastille was nowhere near as bad as it was reputed to be for the end of the 18th century. There's a fantastic book by a German historian named Hans-Jürgen Lusebrink, and he talks about the actual living conditions of the Bastille. And, you could bring your servants and you could shoot pool. And one inmate actually had a gigantic bookshelf constructed so that he could store his private library there. So many prisoners at the Bastille were actually living better than other Parisians, especially the poorest Parisians. Why would someone invent this character of the Comte de Lorge? Well, we don't know who actually invented this character, so it's hard to say for sure, but it's very clear that the story of the Comte de Lorge is one that dovetails very nicely with a narrative about the storming of the Bastille as the overthrow of tyranny. I mean, look at what the guy had endured inside. He was so devastated by his 32 years of confinement that he no longer knew how to live as a free man, right? So it was part of this wave of propaganda, and it was very much a fiction that was meant to kind of add to that optimistic energy of the moment. And what's funny is that over the years, even though many people were really willing to believe this story, others started to kind of question it. And Madame Tussaud dealt with skepticism within her wax museum, because remember, she claims to have met this guy himself and made the wax likeness, even though we know he does not exist. She would publish catalogs and make them available for purchase. And these catalogs contain brief descriptions of every object. So here's what it says about the Comte de Lorge. It says, evidence of this unfortunate man in the Bastille has by some been doubted, but Madame Tussaud is herself a witness of his being taken out of that prison July 14th, 1789. So she pretty much just doubles down on all of the falsehoods.
I think it's one of those things that if you get caught in a lie, you got 2 choices. You can either you double down or you fall on your sword. And there's no shortage of individuals that choose to double down.
That's right. That's right. Yeah,
it is interesting. As you were kind of playing up the story of the prisoner, I was thinking to myself, oh well, there was only 7 prisoners in the Bastille, and I know for a fact that they were allowed to have their own furniture and their own they did customize their lodgings quite some bit. So I was like, I'll be interested to see how much of this is myth and how much of this is legend. So I wasn't completely surprised to find out that the origins of this story were less than reputable. I suppose for those members of your audience, Gavin, that are interested in some of the history of the Bastille and the historiography around it, I think it's my 12th episode, whichever one is the storming of the Bastille. It actually gets into some of the debates amongst historians around the symbolism of the Bastille, and if this was this, as you say, this symbol of tyranny and despotism prior to the fall of the monarchy, or how much of that occurred actually after the fall of the Bastille, and it was kind of retroactively placed on the building. Because as you say, if you go look at the living conditions, particularly in the decades leading up to the fall of the Bastille, the letters de cachet and the like that are used to send prisoners there, this is happening less and less often. The living conditions in there are better than you would expect. It's been quite some time since the Man in the Iron Masks, to put it lightly. So for those interested, there's definitely worth a look out there.
So what is your second pick?
So my second pick is a little unusual, and I've actually chosen the Lion of Lucerne. And the Lion of Lucerne is a stone statue, but it's not actually in France, it's in Switzerland, and it's not even in the French-speaking part of Switzerland either. So I suppose the question is, why have I chosen this statue that's not even in France? Well, first of all, it's beautiful, and it's also a controversial monument. And what it is it's a memorial to a very specific part of the overthrow of the French monarchy. Now, for background, the monarchy was toppled on the 10th of August, 1792, which is just more than 3 years after the fall of the Bastille, and the overthrow itself was quite a bloody event. After the king's safety had been personally secured by the national government, a series of miscommunications occurred, and the end result was that the king's soldiers ended up firing against the insurrectionists. Now, these soldiers were the Swiss Guards, which was a foreign unit staffed by Swiss soldiers tasked with defending the monarchy. And having enraged the insurgents, who felt that they had been lured into a trap, the end result was the so-called Massacre of the Swiss. And the exact numbers are disputed, but one historian who specializes in foreign units in the French army claims that out of the 900 Swiss that were present, perhaps as many as 650 were killed. So you're looking at a number of maybe around 2/3. And those lucky enough to survive might have, of course, died of their wounds after the fact, or indeed in subsequent prison massacres, which broke out in Paris the following month, the infamous September massacres. So the bloodshed around this event, it's horrific, and it remains one of the more contentious components of the revolution's legacy. But what's relevant for us now is actually how these events were remembered in Switzerland. So decades later, an officer of the Swiss Guard, he publishes a book about his comrades in the late 1810s. So this is now after Napoleon's downfall and the monarchy has been restored in France. And this individual, he was not a witness, he wasn't a participant, he had actually been on leave in Switzerland during these events, which is why he was lucky enough to survive. But this book really stirs public interest and support in Switzerland. And shortly thereafter, funds were raised to create a memorial for the Swiss Guards. And this is how we get the Lion of Lucerne, Lucerne being the hometown of this particular officer. Now, the statue itself is a huge sandstone lion. It's about 10 meters in length and 6 meters in height, which is about 33 feet long and 20 feet high. And the beast is actually carved into almost like a shallow den in the side of a cliff face. And it's just above a reflective pool of water. And nowadays, it's surrounded by this beautifully maintained garden. And this in and of itself is a striking view. But if you look closely, then you'll see that there's a whole bunch of symbolism here. So the lion is actually dying. It's impaled by a spear. And this beast, of course, represents the Swiss soldiers that were slaughtered on the 10th of August. The lion's front paw rests on a shield representing the French monarchy. There's another shield nearby that bears the emblems of Switzerland. And then for those that don't read Latin, myself included, the inscription reads, "To the loyalty and bravery of the Swiss." And this is quite a memorable and moving monument. Mark Twain actually called it the most mournful and moving piece of stone in the world. And with an endorsement like that, you can see why there's such interest. And in fact, this particular site sees more than 1 million tourists a year in Switzerland. It's a highly popular tourist attraction. So that's the Lion of Lucerne. I said it was controversial. There's a few reasons for that. At the time, like right from the outset, it was controversial even back in the early 19th century. I mean, if you think about it, this is a monument that glorifies to an extent the old regime of France. It glorifies the death of Swiss citizens on behalf of foreign monarchies. Switzerland's a republic. There's, of course, some tensions there that this monument might be promoting conservative and Catholic values, particularly of old regime France. And Switzerland, of course, does, those members that were more liberal, more progressive, Protestant might have issue with this statue. More recently, the controversy has changed, especially as the statue has become associated with national pride. So in the 20th century in particular, this statue has become a rallying point for far-right nationalists, but it's also served as the backdrop for anti-war protests and demilitarization movements and the like. So what we have here is a bit of a statue that can mean different things to different people. But as I said, it's a beautiful monument. The statue is absolutely gorgeous. It's carved into this cliff face. It's above this reflective pool and surrounded by this absolutely gorgeous garden. So yeah, as I said, it's a highly visited tourist attraction in Switzerland today. So if you find yourself south of Zurich and you'd like to check out not only a beautiful statue, but something that's connected to the French Revolution, do check out the Lion of Lucerne.
That is wonderful. I love that quote from Mark Twain about the most mournful and moving piece of stone in the world.
It's not, Mark Twain's not exactly someone that you would expect to, obviously he's well-traveled, but he wasn't someone that I was expecting to have seen the Lion of Lucerne. So I was quite amused when I came across that quote.
Well, I will move on to my second pick, which is the Phantasmagoria. So the easiest way for me to start is in 1799 with a showman by the name of Etienne Gaspard Robertson, also Etienne Gaspard Robert. Really interesting figure. He lectured in physics. He also dabbled in ballooning because why not? But he also became a showman and kind of specialized in this form of entertainment that is called the Phantasmagoria. And we have really detailed accounts of what his show was like when he was presenting in Paris in 1799. So I'm going to give you a description of that. So you would go to the convent of Capuchins, a former nunnery, and you would buy your ticket. You would proceed inside, and at this point in time, the convent was in a state of decay. So you would have walked past crumbling walls. You would have proceeded into the defunct cloisters where there were all kinds of eerie sights to be seen. And eventually you would head through a large doorway decorated with Egyptian hieroglyphics. So there's a sense of, the exotic, the mysterious, what have you, as you pass into what was the main auditorium. The main auditorium was completely dark, save for a single lamp at first. So you would take your seat along with the other spectators and the show would begin. Now, when the show started, the light would go off. So the entire room was plunged into darkness, which was uncommon at that time because everyone, when they went to plays, they watched performances by candlelight. In fact, it was someone's job to light literally hundreds of candles so that spectators could watch plays. So to watch any kind of performance in the darkness was novel and extremely unnerving. It really freaked people out at this point in history. So you would hear thunder sound effects. These were created probably with sheet metal that was kind of rattled. And there would be a musician who was playing what's called the glass harmonica, which you might have seen. It's like a series of glasses with different tonalities. And if you rub your fingertips on them, they kind of produce these ghostly tones. So you're in the complete darkness, and then suddenly in front of you, you see a series of images, and they are ghosts and skeletons, other undead beings. In some cases, the ghosts are just kind of generic ghosts. In other cases, you're supposed to recognize them. So there was a Gothic novelist named Matthew Lewis who published a book called The Monk in the early 1790s, and he made famous this character called the Bleeding Nun, who was this nun who terrorizes a character in that book, and she has like a blood stain on her chest. It's all very scary stuff. So that's a fictional character. But in other cases, they would show spirits of political figures. And this is where we get to the French Revolution. Robertson would actually project the spirits of politicians who had died in the Reign of Terror. So you would see the spirit of Danton or Robespierre in front of you. Basically, the ghosts would appear out of darkness, they would approach you, and then they would kind of retreat back into the darkness. These shows were absolutely terrifying at the time. There are all kinds of stories about, women swooning and grown men leaping to their feet and waving their canes in the air because they were so terrified of the spooks as they kind of advanced on them. So how did it work? It was all thanks to a marvelous invention called the magic lantern, which was invented toward the end of the 17th century. It's basically a precursor to the modern slide projector. What you do is you would paint images on glass slides, insert those slides into this device, and then the device, the magic lantern, would project those images onto a projection surface. So you might have used a wall or a screen. What was really cool was that for the Phantasmagoria, they would project these images onto columns of smoke, which, you can imagine that would give a really cool look to ghosts, for example, and make them kind of look vaporous, ethereal, kind of insubstantial. So that's Etienne Gaspard Robertson. So there's a pretty cool tie-in with Madame Tussaud here. So a few years before Robertson rolls into town, in 1792-93, another pioneer of the Phantasmagoria named variously Paul Philipsthal or Paul Philidor comes to Paris and is exhibiting. We have less information about how exactly Philipsthal's Phantasmagoria unfolded, but we can reasonably imagine that it was pretty similar to what Robertson was doing a few years later. So the story goes that at one point in early 1793, so it would have been shortly after the execution of Louis XVI, Philipsthal displayed an image of Louis XVI's spirit. And then his assistant made a grave mistake. They wanted to change the slide so that they could display the next skeleton or ghost or whatever. So the assistant reaches into the magic lantern, raises the glass slide with the image of Louis XVI painted on it. Now, what that looked like to the audience was that the ghost of Louis XVI was floating upward to heaven. And the crowd went absolutely berserk because for them, Louis XVI was an enemy of the revolution. And if anything, he sort of belonged in hell. That was the idea. So there was a really serious disturbance at the performance venue, and Philip Stahl was apparently taken into custody. So Philip Stahl's wife wants to get him out of trouble. So she goes to the home of a noted Jacobin and also the owner of the most famous wax museum in Paris, which is a guy named Philippe Curtieu. He is Tussaud's kind of surrogate father, and he taught her basically everything she knew about wax modeling. And he was also active in revolutionary politics. We know that for a fact. And he may have had some degree of influence. So anyway, Philip Stahl's wife goes to him and, according to Madame Tussaud in her memoirs, persuades him to intervene on Philip Stahl's behalf. And then there's a scene in the memoirs where Curtieu goes and basically bribes Robespierre to set Philip Stahl free. And I was about to say, this sounds about as believable as the gentleman in the deepest, darkest depths.
It cost a Lord.
Yeah,
of all the people to bribe, if you said Danton, but Robespierre, that's...
No, it gets even crazier, right? Because he's supposedly the incorruptible, right? And it's like, well, let me tell you, he's actually corruptible. But what's even crazier is that he's said to have spent all his money on sex workers, essentially, which is another detail that really does not square with what we know about Robespierre at all. So apparently, Philip Stahl is able to go free. Now, I think we've sensed a recurring theme. Madame Tussaud, not the most trustworthy historical figure we've ever encountered. She said a lot of things to generate publicity, but it's sort of attractive to think that she and Philip Stahl had crossed paths in some regard in the early 1790s, say, because in 1802, Philip Stahl actually does go to Paris and proposes a partnership with Madame Tussaud, and he actually convinces her to leave Paris and go to London where they can exhibit together. And we know that that happened for a fact. And that's, why she leaves Paris and she never goes back.
There you go. There's. I feel like, especially with someone like Madame Tussaud, who's such an entertainer, like at their core. There's the key events that happened, and then the story or the narrative about why something occurred. It reminds me some of the tales that my old uncle likes to say, where it's like you just kind of sit there and nod, and it's highly entertaining. But what's that old expression? Never let the truth get in the way of a good story. That's
right. Right. That's exactly right. She claims actually to have had two brothers who were Swiss guardsmen and who got slaughtered.
Oh, well, I hadn't come across that one either. But yeah, I mean, I know as you cover in your show, and as you said earlier when you're doing the introduction, I know that there's all sorts of morbid curiosities that she kept in her, House of Horrors. So I wouldn't put it past her to have a uniform of a Swiss guard or two. But yeah, the Swiss brothers, the family tree is confusing me at that point in time.
It's all very confusing. But yeah, so that's all I have to say about the Phantasmagoria. So maybe you can take it away with your third and final pick.
Sure. So I've been a little cheeky, I suppose, not only with my last one, choosing something outside of France, but now I'm not even going to choose like a particular piece of artwork at all. And I suppose for my third pick, something that's quite interesting about the French Revolution and sets the tone for future revolutions in the 19th and in particular in the 20th century. I mean, obviously the French Revolution inspires a wide range of art, but I actually want to talk about the opposite. I want to touch on how the French Revolution inspires the destruction of art. So to back up a bit, by the time that you get to the second year of the Republic, which is late 1793, most of 1794, France is in full-blown cultural revolution. I mean, yes, the nation is at war with most of Europe. Yes, it's going through the reign of terror. Yes, it's purging members of its own government left, right, and center. But it's also going through a top-to-bottom cultural revolution, and everything in society is being or has already been turned on its head, and art is no different. And so, we do see this expressed in creative ways, in the creation of new songs, new plays, new statues, etc. But we also see it in destructive ways. And in an effort to found this kind of regenerated society, in an effort to kind of establish this new virtuous republic of free citizens, one that's free of superstition and ignorance, the art of previous centuries was quite literally on the chopping block. And this is in no small part because of the fact that the previous regime, the French monarchy, and then other institutions associated with it, such as the Catholic Church, these institutions had used art to help support their own political power, to help bolster their own legitimacy. And so in attacking these symbols, in attacking these artworks, the revolutionaries were delegitimizing the old regime. They were diminishing the monarchy and the aristocracy and the church. And, they were diminishing the fundamental pillars of the France that came before, and a France that was no longer welcome. And so what did this destruction actually look like? What did this kind of revolutionary iconoclasm or revolutionary vandalism actually look like on the ground? Well, at times the destruction of art could be quite methodical, and it could be done in a way that was quite literally helping the creation of this new order. So, for example, thousands of church bells across the country were melted down to supply critical metals for the war effort. Likewise, bronze statues, elaborate silverware, any sort of precious metal workings in a church or a palace or a chateau, that was all fair game. And to be frank, that's kind of understandable. I mean, we talk about World War I and World War II being examples of total war. There's no shortage of historians who see the French Revolutionary Wars as being the first example of total war conflict. But for all the examples that you've got of the destruction of art, which served the war effort, there are other examples which, the utility is more about erasing the power and prestige of the old regime. And so all sorts of paintings, statues, and even buildings were destroyed for being tied to the monarchy, aristocracy, the church, feudalism, etc. So, for example, in one commune in the southeast, more than 200 statues of saints were tried and executed. In Paris, the statues on the facade of the Notre Dame were beheaded in the mistaken belief that they represented French kings. Lyon, which is the second city of France, if you like, Lyon felt the brunt of de-Christianization efforts by some, and so beautiful decorative works across the city's buildings and cemeteries and the like, they were all destroyed. And finally, another great example in the Department of Art, there's a representative on mission there, a gentleman named Albert. He actually moderates the terror in Marseille. He's one of the representatives on mission that oversees the city after its rebellion against Paris, collapses. But despite the moderation there, he's actually very radical in his views of destroying art and buildings and symbols and the like, which are an affront to the revolution's values. He ends up pulling down perhaps 800 church steeples and many chateau towers as well, on the grounds that their height was an outrage to the egalitarian principles of all true republicans. So I suppose what I wanted to point out here for this third section was that, yes, the revolution inspired and creates all sorts of beautiful art, but it is also noteworthy that this is a period of ideological renewal. This is a new age, and there was a very deliberate effort to expunge and eradicate those pieces of art which contested the legitimacy of the new regime, and so many great artworks were destroyed. And this, you can see the parallels and the inspirations here of, say, some 20th century revolutions and totalitarian regimes looking towards the French Revolution as a modern example of how to, expunge the unwanted symbols of a previous regime.
I'm intrigued by the idea of destroying artwork in the name of helping to create this new order.
Even before the revolution, there were some members of the kind of intellectual elites that even those working on the encyclopedia project, that were very vocal that they felt that art would need to be destroyed. Not everyone had that view. And in fact, the National Assembly that we were talking about with the tennis court oath, they actually created a commission to try to bring important monuments from across the country into one location for safekeeping, because they appreciated that there would be these impulses and desires to destroy this art. It didn't work out so well because the location that they kept the monuments in ended up getting vandalized itself. But I mean, it is from this era that we get the word vandalism from. It's from the French Revolution that we get that word. It's a fascinating piece of history, and you can see, as I said, the parallels, say, between the communist revolutions of the USSR, for example, and how they treat art. That's got a lot of parallels and inspiration back to what was occurring here in the early 1790s.
All right, top fact that the word vandalism comes from this period in history. That is awesome.
There's a historical inspiration for that word as well. It is inspired by the Vandals, the Germanic peoples, the tribe that the people that know a little bit about the ancient Roman Empire might be familiar with. The idea being that they were linking those members of the government which were critical of what was occurring. They were trying to link kind of barbarism and senseless violence to the destruction of art. And that is why even today, when we talk about vandalism, it's often with a connotation that it's pointless, that it's senseless, that there's no sense behind it. That connotation of the word, again, is also inspired by the French Revolution. And in fact, if you were to Google a definition of the word vandalism right now, it will give you a sentence that says mindless vandalism. So yeah, everything about the word in the modern context is because of the French Revolution.
Wow. Amazing. The more you know. Well, I will finish off with my third pick, which is a play about the French Revolution, written after the French Revolution had run its course. So it's called Danton's Death, and it was written by the German playwright Georg Büchner, one of my all-time favorites. I used to be a theater historian before I went into podcasting, and I also studied German in undergrad. A few words about Büchner, because he is just an absolutely fascinating figure. He was born in central Germany in 1813, and he actually died of typhus at the age of 23. And at that time, he was lecturing in comparative anatomy at the University of Zurich. He was apparently this lecturer of extraordinary promise and was just absolutely brilliant. And in fact, if you're curious about comparative anatomy, I can recommend an episode of a podcast, namely Gray History, because you did an episode on Georges Cuvier, right?
I did, yeah. One of the bonus episodes was, there was a few bonus episodes on scientists during the French Revolution, and so we were getting into the history of life sciences and biology and evolution and the like, yes.
It's really cool. I highly recommend it. There's a big debate as to whether species could go extinct at this time in history, and I had no idea about that before I listened to the episode, so it comes highly recommended. Anyway, back to Georg Büchner. He's lecturing in comparative anatomy, dies of typhus at the age of 23. At that point, he has written one work of prose fiction, 3 plays, a political manifesto of sorts, and a treatise on the nervous system of the barbel, which is a kind of fish. This was related to his work as a comparative anatomist. Only one of those plays, Danton's Death, was published during his lifetime. That happened in 1835, and it was heavily censored, so it hardly even counts. Other than that, all of his writing remained unpublished for several years. It was published posthumously. Fast forward to the late 1870s, early 1880s. His works are rediscovered, and the literary community is just like, oh my God, this is the birth of modern drama. This was the birth of modern prose fiction. They basically came to view Georg Büchner as this visionary genius who was writing about topics in the 1830s that would become really kind of fashionable toward the end of the century. You have to remember that he wrote these in his early 20s, right? And he's now considered like one of the most significant writers in German, period. He ranks among the best. Danton's Death is about the final days of Georges Danton in the Reign of Terror. It has been called the best first play ever written So what makes the play so special? I mean, there are a lot of things I could say, but I just want to zero in quickly on one that seems relevant to this collaboration because we're both history podcasters. Obviously, Danton's Death is a history play, right? It's about a historical event. There's nothing new really about history plays or historical drama at this point in history. Listeners may be familiar with Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. He also wrote about Antony and Cleopatra. He had dealt with historical subject matter way before Georg Büchner, and he drew heavily on sources to kind of inform the way that he dramatized those historical events. And Georg Büchner would have read Shakespeare. He knew Shakespeare quite well, actually. So he knew that he was not really reinventing the wheel by writing a play about a historical event. What is pretty cool about Büchner's approach to writing a history play, though, is that he believed that a history play should come as close to history as it possibly could. What he did was basically to track down as many speeches by prominent revolutionaries as possible. So speeches of, Robespierre, Camille Desmoulins, Danton, all these guys. He tracked down those speeches and then incorporated lengthy passages from them directly into his script. So he really wanted to make sure that the genuine voices of the revolution were being heard in this play. I should add, too, I forgot to mention that Georg Büchner was himself involved in revolutionary activity. So he had written this political manifesto and wanted to have it published with an illegal newspaper and almost got arrested for doing that. And in fact, he was living basically in constant fear of getting arrested for that entire fiasco while he was working on Danton's Death. So quickly, before I wrap up, I just want to read an excerpt from one of my favorite scenes in the play. As you might imagine, the central conflict unfolds between Danton and Robespierre. So in this scene, Danton goes to confront Robespierre about the Reign of Terror, really, and Robespierre is trying to defend it as this virtuous act. So Robespierre starts and he says, "Vice must be punished. Virtue must rule through the terror." Danton says, "I don't understand the word punished. You and your virtue, Robespierre. You've taken no money, you've run up no debts, you've slept with no women, you've always worn a decent coat, and you've never gotten drunk. Robespierre, you are infuriatingly righteous. I would be ashamed to wander between heaven and earth for 30 years with such a priggish face, for the miserable pleasure of finding others less virtuous than myself. Is there no small secret voice inside you, whispering occasionally, 'You're a fraud'?" So he's just kind of gone off on Robespierre with this lengthy speech, and Robespierre simply responds, "My conscience is clear." Forward response, so just boom. And then Danton responds with one of my favorite lines in the play, although I really have a limited understanding of what it means. But so Robespierre says, "My conscience is clear," and Danton responds by saying, "Conscience is a mirror before which a monkey pinches itself." Yeah. So I'm going to end on that note. Hopefully that has provoked some thoughts. Let me just read that out again. Conscience is a mirror before which a monkey pinches itself.
I think that underscores, if nothing else, how two of the great figures of the revolution, one of them thinks the sky is red and the other thinks the sky is green. They just, I mean, it's a slight exaggeration. They do agree on quite a few things, but on certain issues, particularly in one's, values and how one should live, they did not see eye to eye, to put it mildly.
Well, I think we've done it. Is there anything else we need to say?
No, I don't think so. So, Gavin, I think I've had a blast. I think you've had a blast. I'm sure that our listeners would have learned a lot. Do you want to maybe just say one last time where they can find you and what you're doing with The Art of Crime?
Again, my third season is all about Madame Tussaud and the Chamber of Horrors. You can consider the first half of the season the French Revolution viewed from the perspective of the Wax Museum.
Perfect. Well, for those that are interested, if you want to go deep into the French Revolution, you can find Grey History wherever you get your history podcasts. If you search for the French Revolution, it will come up. Or if you search for Grey History, it's GREY, because just like history, spelling is also full of ambiguities and nuances. And as you can tell from the Australian accent, there's some slightly different spelling of colours, including that word itself.
Great. Well, thanks again for talking to me today.
Perfect. Thanks, Gavin. Have a good one.
Thank you for listening to this fantastic collaboration episode with the Art of Crime podcast. You can find The Art of Crime wherever you get your audio art. A reminder that between now and the next episode, please do find a chance to recommend the show to at least one other person. The revolution needs all the help it can get. Don't miss the recent video update uploaded to Patreon, and a reminder that those members on the True Revolutionary tier already have early access to episode 73, Napoleon's Triumph. Those same members can now also RSVP for July's livestream. More information is on Patreon. Before you go, one final reminder that I need your help to stay on the air. If you could contribute just a single cup of coffee when main narrative episodes are released, that would be an absolute lifesaver. Anyway, that's enough from me. So thank you for listening, thank you for your support, stay safe, and have a great day.